person, everybody who may be joining us either now or later by way of technology. The technology that we're utilizing is for the benefit of those who are physically not able to be here. And so we're happy to provide that for you if you're in that category. In this, again, we're switching. Adam normally has taught on Wednesday evenings. He's now going to Sunday mornings, and I'm going to Wednesday evenings because of his full-time teaching position that he is now engaged in. So we're going to be studying 2 Thessalonians. I don't know that we'll wrap up the letter tonight, but we do want to go to 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude once we finish 2 Thessalonians. So that certainly will be next week's study. If we lack any, we'll wrap up 2 Thessalonians, and then we'll look forward to beginning 1 John. Not John, but 1 John. 1 John has 5 chapters. John has 21. So we're just looking at 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude starting next Wednesday evening. But now as we wrap up this very brief letter, sequel that Paul wrote to the church in Thessalonica, in verses 6 through 15, we title this section, Dealing with the Disorderly. Dealing with the Disorderly. And Adam, if you don't mind, if you will, read for us, read for us verses 6 through 9, first of all. 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 9.
Now we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you would draw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly, and not after the tradition which ye received of us. For yourselves know how you ought to follow us, for we behaved not ourselves disorderly among you. Neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but worked with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you. Not because we have not power, but to make ourselves an example unto you to follow us.
Okay. Now we covered last 6 as we ended class last week, and notice this is a command. The command comes by the authority of Christ. So it's not that Paul has any ill will toward anybody, or that this, again, is coming from him. This is coming from heaven by the authority of Christ. And the command is a withdrawal from every brother that walks disorderly. Now, in this specific context, what's the disorderly problem Paul is addressing in the church at Thessalonica? They stopped working. Okay, they stopped working. Again, because of misunderstanding Paul's teaching regarding the second coming, they felt like, what if Jesus is about to come back? No sense going to work today. Well, he didn't come that day. He didn't come the next day, and on down the line, but they never went back to work. So that's the specific context of disorderliness mentioned in this passage. And of course, we can make application to other contexts as well, but we first of all want to begin with the specific situation in the congregation there with which he is dealing. And he's going to elaborate now on that in the following verses. So verse 7, you yourselves know how you ought to follow us. Now the word ought can be translated must. It is a very strong word, not should. The word is not should. The word is ought, or the word is must. You know how you ought to follow us. You may have another translation that instead of the word follow, you may have the word imitate. You know how you ought to imitate us. We can all go back on a mental excursion in our minds to when we were children, and we play the game follow the leader, correct? Somebody was chosen leader, and whatever the leader did, you were supposed to do, or you were out of the game. Sometimes that was sort of a foolish game, wasn't it? Depending upon how crazy the leader was. If the leader walked through mud, you had no choice but to walk through mud. You know, if the leader broke out a glass window, well, that's when I get out of the game. You don't do everything the leader does, especially foolishly, but Paul is not foolish, obviously. And so, in the spiritual realm, Paul certainly was an example. You know how you ought to follow us, not only Paul, but his traveling companions as well. Of course, Paul would tell the Corinthians, I want you to follow me only as what? I follow Christ. I want you to imitate me as I imitate Christ. If there's an area in my life where I'm not imitating Christ, then you don't follow my lead, is the idea. And that's the idea here. You know how you ought to follow us. Paul was a good role model, yes? Paul was a great role model, indeed he was. He preached the truth and he practiced the truth. And obviously we want good role models today. And if that's the case, we need to be what? If I want good role models, I need to be myself what? A good role model. If I expect it of you, then I ought to expect it certainly of myself. I need to be a good role model. If I'm going to make this world a better place, where do I need to start? Right here. I need to start right here if I want to make this world a better place. So Paul says, you know how you should follow us. Now the question is, are we so living that we could say this same thing to others? I want you to follow me. I want you to follow me. When it comes to the church, what if everyone were like me? Well, if it was the case with some people, we might as well shut the church down, right? Because they're here once or twice a year. Or on the other hand, can I say I want you to be like me when it comes to the church? If I'm here every possible service I can be here, then you can say that. When it comes to our attitude, what if everybody's attitude were like my attitude? Would others be cheered? Would others be despondent because they were like me? If everyone were like me, would people be optimistic? Would people be pessimistic? On and on down the line we can go. But really, and we're not bragging. Paul isn't bragging. That's not what we're implying. But we need to set examples that others can look to. I mean, again, if we want good role models, we need to be good role models as well. So, now in this specific context, again, he's addressing people who are not working. Was Paul a worker? Absolutely, he was a worker. That's what he's going to talk about here. He says, we behave not ourselves disorderly among you. Verse 6, withdraw yourselves from every brother who walks disorderly. Verse 7, we were not disorderly when we were among you. If you have a different translation in verse 7, instead of the word disorderly, what word do you have? Idle. We were not idle, I-D-L-E, not I-D-O-L. I-D-O-L is a bad thing. I-D-L-E mean, well, it's a bad thing too. It can be a bad thing, especially when it comes to work. So those who had stopped work, verse 6, were idle, but we were not idle when we were with you. That is, Paul believed in work, and here we're talking about secular work. We know that he worked missionary work and gospel preaching work and so forth, the work of an apostle, but he's specifically talking about secular work in this text. So he believed in it, he engaged in it, he taught the importance of secular work. Now, what was Paul's secular work? What did he do for a living? He was a tent maker. Let's look at Acts 18. Acts 18 is just a reminder. It is said that every Jewish boy was taught a trade when he was growing up. What trade was our Lord taught? He was a carpenter. Carpentry. So he knew about building things. Paul was a Jewish young man, and his parents saw to it that he was taught a trade as a young man. Acts 18, verse number 2, Well, he came to Corinth, verse 1. He found Aquila and Priscilla, verse 2. What was their occupation? What was their secular work? They were tent makers. So verse 3, if you worked the same line of work, you usually congregated together. You may have lived near one another. And he stayed with them, verse 3, because he was of the same craft or trade. Paul stayed with them and worked because by their occupation they were tent makers. If you worked in silver, probably you associated with people who worked in silver. Blacksmiths, tent makers. You usually associated with people with whom you worked. Now, would there have been a big demand in those days for tents? Absolutely. Now we have to take off our 21st century glasses and go to the first century. In our culture, in this part of the world, people that use tents usually do so when? Camping and quote, roughing it, correct? Roughing it in that sense. But there's not, unless you're a mountaineer, a backpacker, or a camper, there's not just a huge demand for tents in our culture. We'll buy a plot of land and we'll build a house on it. Okay, that's our culture. And if there's a tent, we stick it in the backyard or wherever. But keep in mind, in this period of time, in this day and time, a lot of people, this is where they lived. Not everybody did, but a lot of people lived in tents. Now, in your mind, think of some pros and cons of living in a tent. Some advantages and disadvantages of living in a tent. Now, go ahead and discount electricity, because they didn't have electricity back then, whether they lived in a house or a tent, so that really doesn't matter. But what would be some advantages to living in a tent? Portable. That's probably the best advantage. And if you were a nomad and raised sheep or livestock, I mean, once the sheep ate all the grass next to your tent, what'd you have to do? You got to find new grazing ground, so you rolled up your tent, took it with you, and you led your sheep elsewhere. And you set up your house again, your tent again. That's probably the number one advantage of having a tent. It was portable. What might be another advantage? What about? It's going to be cheaper. I mean, it's cheaper then, and obviously would be cheaper today. Not very terribly expensive. You wouldn't want to be gone and come back and find somebody stolen your tent, but that would not be the end of the world. Okay, you can replace the tent fairly easily. And a tent, I mean, it did what it was designed to do, right? It gave you shade in the summer. It gave you some protection from the elements when it rained, when it was cold. I mean, it was better than nothing. It offered protection. And the material they used to make tents, I'm told, was goat's hair. And at first, you had to let the rain hit it, because it would shrink and would become waterproof. So there were great advantages to living in tents, especially if you lived a life where you roam from place to place. Now, on the other hand, we don't have to use a lot of imagination here, do we? What would be some disadvantages to living in a tent? It's not as durable. Do you want to be caught out in a tornado in a tent? You don't want to be you want to be, if you can, get underground. I mean, not even in a house if you can get out of the way. So it's not going to be nearly as durable when you're at the mercy of the weather. I mean, a tent can give you shade, yes, but if it's 130 degrees outside, that's a relief. And the wintertime, I mean, it'll protect you from the wind, but again, you're going to have a fire, yes, but still, you're at the mercy of the weather. What about bugs? I mean, we can't keep all bugs out of our house, right? You're not going to start keeping bugs out of a tent. I mean, it'll help. That would be obviously a negative. Now, to us, I mean, we had much rather I had sleep in my house in my nice bed. Now, I've slept in a tent on the ground before, and I was 10 years old at the time, and my body could take it. I woke up the next morning and I didn't feel the effects of that. I wouldn't dare sleep on the ground tonight. You'd have to help me up in the morning. So obviously comfort would be a disadvantage, and I know they didn't have indoor plumbing then anywhere, but you're not going to have that in a tent. And so, there are just a whole lot of disadvantages. But to each his own, right? To each his own. If that's how people want to live, that's absolutely fine. And this was really one of the basic options the poor people had then. You had a tent. As we said, tents then were not made of canvas or the lightweight, I forget the term used of these tents today. You put in your back and pop it out and it just makes a great big tent. But the tents they used, again, would have been made of animal hair, goat's hair, usually black goat's hair. It was the same as the sackcloth people wore when they grieved. We talked about that Sunday, didn't we? About wearing sackcloth. Very uncomfortable. Well, obviously, animal skins, to make tents out of those, you had to cut them. You had to sew them. And that would have been awfully hard work. Hard work on your hands. And I remember my mama, she worked for years, much of her life, making pajamas at a pajama factory. She had the luxury of having a what? Sewing machine. That needle go up 1,000 times a second, it seemed like. But you know what? That was some hard work too. That was some hard work. You go in early, stay all day. It was some tough work. This would have been especially hard work. You can think about your hands, calluses and blisters and arthritis developing and the pain of all of that. So I said all that to say Paul was a worker. Had he not worked, he would have been disorderly among them. What he's saying is, you folks who aren't working are disorderly, and you need to get back to work. And if you don't get back to work, the church needs to withdraw from you. That's verse 6. Verse 8, when we were with you, we worked, neither did we eat any man's bread for naught. The word naught means what? For nothing, right? In other words, we didn't sponge off or freeload off anybody. When we were in you folks in Thessalonica, know that. When we ate our bread, we paid for it, is what he's saying here. We didn't eat any man's bread for free. That is, we bought it. Now the word for bread here, it doesn't mean they just ate bread, nothing else. The word bread is equivalent to our word food. Our word food describes what? Food, right? Bread, meat, vegetables, whatever. Oftentimes in the Bible, the word bread is our word food. It didn't mean just bread, as in bunny bread. It meant food. We didn't eat, it included vegetables and meat and so forth. Sometimes, and that's certainly the usage here. So, when we ate, we bought our lunch. We worked, we had money, and we bought our own food and didn't freeload off anybody. In fact, he says, verse 8, we wrought. That's a King James word, wrought. It means what? Worked. We worked with labor and travail. Both of those words mean to work, and they both mean to work really hard. We worked really hard. How often? Night and day. That is, on a regular basis. It didn't mean we never slept. That's not what the meaning here. But we work continually. I mean, we work really hard continually. Making these tents, we put in long hours for the purpose that we might not be chargeable to any of you. What does that mean? Burden, okay? We did not want to be a burden. If we rolled into town and just pulled up the chair to the table and said, we want you to feed us, we are your guests, we're going to be here so many weeks, and we want you to provide us every meal, a place to stay, yada, yada, that would have been a burden to the church in Thessalonica. That was not our approach. We didn't want to burden the church. Now, I think there are people today who are not ashamed to what? Burden the church. There are folks who have no shame whatever in bilking churches out of money. They'll go to this church and that church and that church, and they'll make the rounds, claiming that they're in dire circumstances, when you find out later this is how they're making their living. Just going from church to church, taking advantage of the charity of benevolent people. I think sometimes preachers can be a burden to churches, chargeable to churches. And this will stick in my craw until I die. But anybody who holds a gospel meeting and comes up afterwards and says, you didn't pay me enough, is a fellow who ought not be preaching, number one, and who is a burden to the church, number two. And that's happened twice I didn't do it. It happened twice to where I preached. And I'm not about to do that. But to have the audacity to say, you didn't pay me enough, that's being a burden. That's putting it mildly in my opinion. But enough of that. Preach the word. We were taught, preach the word. If people can support you financially, fine. If they cannot support you financially, fine. Guess who's going to take care of you? God is going to take care of you, and He's never let us down. I promise He's never let us down. He's never failed. That's Paul's mindset. Did Paul have a right to expect financial support from them? That's verse 9. When we came, we worked because we didn't want to be a burden, but verse 9, it wasn't because we don't have the power, or we did not have the power or the right to expect financial support from you. The Bible says the worker is worthy of his hire. The Bible says those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel, 1 Corinthians 9, so many other passages. When Paul was in Thessalonica, the church at Philippi sent to his needs time and again. So certainly churches or preachers or missionaries or whomever have the God-given right to be supported by the church. Paul had the right to be supported by the church at Thessalonica. But in essence, he said, I'm going to waive that right. I'm going to forego that right. There are things more important. I want to give you an example for you to follow us. The example in what area? Specifically, of working. Of working. With all these people who had stopped work because they misunderstood Paul's teaching, and Paul himself is not working, well, they'd put two and two together really quick, wouldn't they? Well, Paul's not working, I'm not going to work. So I don't want to give any credence at all to that mindset. I'm going to forego my right so as to give you an example. This is what you might call humility on display. Humility on display, the example of Jesus. An example that we so desperately need today. I'm not going to demand my rights. So many today demand their rights, don't they? And they're just chomping at the bit to find a lawyer whenever they feel their rights are violated. Paul says, I'm willing to do without. I'll do secular work if it will help the gospel cause. I know that Adam has studied many of what are called the pioneer preachers. And what those poor fellows, how they survived, is when you read about their lives, God took care of them. That's the only way they survived. God took care of them. They didn't, again, have buildings at the time. They didn't have much of a congregation at the time. They were trying to establish congregations, and most of them supported themselves financially just to spread the gospel and the gospel message. It is not a discredit for a man to support himself while he is preaching the gospel. And somebody who does that is not a second-rate preacher to somebody who, quote, preaches full-time. Again, that's the mindset that some have developed in this professional clergy world in which we live. But we've got the example of Paul. Whatever it takes, if it means secular work, then we'll do secular work, he says, if that's what it takes to preach the gospel. Notice verse 10. For even when we were with you, this, what I'm writing you here, is something we've already told you before. I told you once, and what? I'm telling you again. Even when we were with you, we commanded you, if any would not work, neither should he eat. Now that's the law, right? Do we find that law in nature? What about animals out here? Do they just sit around waiting for somebody to drop off food? Well, pets probably do, but animals in the wild know they either find food or they die. You get out, if you're a bird, you get out early, and you seek all day long to provide for you and your young. The law of nature is you work or you die. What about the law of God? You work. If you don't work, you don't eat. Again, as we've said many times, the very first thing God gave Adam was a job. A job. He gave Adam a job. Again, hard work came because of sin, but work was in existence before sin ever occurred. Get to work. Now, when Adam sinned, God said, guess what? In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. Now it's going to be hard. Because you sinned, it's going to be hard. You're going to have thorns to deal with and other maladies of life to deal with. But again, work was before there was sin. Paul says, regarding the church at Thessalonica, for those people who will not go back to work, do not what? Feed them. Do not feed these people who will not go back to work. Let them go hungry, and if they go hungry long enough, guess what? One of two things will happen. They'll either die or they'll go back to work. Now, this may be harsh. We're talking about able-bodied people here. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about Christians on top of that. People who ought to know better. If you're not going to work, then you have no business eating. He's condemning laziness. He's not condemning, and we want to emphasize, he is not condemning people who literally cannot work. There are people who cannot work. We know that. There are people who are handicapped. There are people who are incapacitated. And in some areas, there are places where jobs are few and far between. Do we live in one of those places? No. No, not at all. We don't live in one of those places now. But the Bible emphasizes helping those in need. Don't steal, rather work, that you may have to give to those in need. Ephesians 4:28. And so we want to emphasize, he's not talking about people who cannot work. He's talking about people who can but refuse to. You're not going to work, then you have no business eating. Now in our day, I believe if more able-bodied people were hungry, more able-bodied people would what? Go to work. But, when we have systems set up, and I believe with all my heart, not trying to judge anybody's intentions, I believe that people have good intentions. And I believe that a lot of government programs were designed for the good of people with needs. The problem is we have so many people who abuse something that is good, and they are freeloading, if you will. Not off the church, but off the government. And so that's simply not right. And again, I can make more money staying at home than I can going to work. Or the more babies I have, the bigger check I'll draw. And I'm not being fictitious, as you know. It happens sadly, and that's so very sad. Get back to work. If you're able-bodied, if you can find a job, folks out there, if you can't find a job, we'll find you one. Just look in the paper. I mean, I looked in the paper today, ads begging for people to come to work. Don't work, don't eat. Now, verse 11. Talking about the church. People who should know better. For we hear how he heard this, we don't know. It may have been Timothy. Timothy took the first letter to Thessalonica and came back. On his trip back to Paul, he may have told Paul about what Paul's talking about here. May have been that some Christian from Thessalonica came down south and told Paul in Corinth about this, but whatever, it wasn't a rumor, it wasn't hearsay. This is legitimate truth. We hear there are some which walk among you, Christians in the church, disorderly. Verse 6, withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly. Verse 7, we were not disorderly. Verse 11, we hear there are some who walk among you disorderly, and he sort of defines disorderly for us, right? Working not at all. The word disorderly in this passage talks about those who are idle, who simply will not work. And what has this led to? Busy bodies. They should have been busy where? At work. But because they stopped work, they're busy in other people's what? Business. Work matters, correct? Now this is not a Bible verse. An idle mind is what? The devil's workshop. You will not find that. Now, I think maybe in one of those off-the-wall translations it's in there, but in the Bible it's not there in those exact words. But it is there in principle. People who don't have anything to do and have a lot of spare time on their hands, what happens? You get into trouble. You get into trouble. That's the situation here. These are busy. But what is a busybody in your own terms? I didn't say who is one. I said what is one. Busy with other people's matters. I guess we really already defined that. And it can be a dangerous thing to have a lot of spare time on one's hands. You know, if you do, you start thinking things you ought not think, and then you start doing things you ought not do. And I know we are at a stage in our lives where I can't fathom having spare time to be a busybody. I can't fathom that position. There's just not enough hours in the day to get done what needs to be done. But if you're not working, you've got all the time in the world. And God's cure for not being busy is to have us working. Okay? So the problem, again, in this day with not working, they did not have Social Security checks, they did not have retirement accounts, they did not have government programs. In this day, if you're not working, the only way you're eating is by handout. That's the only way you're eating, is by handout, freeloading, sponging off others. And so, as a result, verse 12, now them that are such, busybodies, freeloaders, them that are such we command, we're giving you the law of the Lord. This is not my opinion. We command you by Jesus, and we want to encourage you. It's not like we're taking a sledgehammer to you. We want to encourage you to do the right thing. That with quietness they work and eat their own bread. Paul in essence is saying, I had much rather encourage you to do right than to have to try to make you do right. I'd much rather encourage you to do right than for this withdrawal to take place. A loving parent had much rather instruct a child correct than discipline a child. No parent, loving parent, loves disciplining a child. You know, Junior, here's where you've done wrong. Let's do right next time. Junior doesn't take the advice, then the discipline has to come, obviously. So we command you, we exhort you that notice how they should work. with quietness they work. Now, some people are good workers, but what is their problem? They're not quiet when they work. They're busybodies even while they're working is the idea. You may know people like that where you work. I mean, all they do is talk, 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 and talk. They do a good job, but they still talk about everybody. And I guarantee you, if they're talking to you about everybody, they're also talking about who? They're talking about you to others. I guarantee you that. So a good rule of thumb is when you work quietly. You do your job, you keep your mouth shut, you mind your own business especially when it comes to the matters of others. So get back to work and do your work quietly and eat whose bread? Eat the church's bread. Eat your neighbor's bread. No, what? Eat your own bread. You make your own money, you buy your own bread, and you eat your own bread. And stop freeloading off others. Get back to work, is what Paul is saying. Do you think this had a negative impact on the community at Thessalonica? Here's the church, the New Testament. We are the saved. We are people of God. And yet within the church, don't you know people outside the church saw these freeloaders? Here they walk to work every day, and they see this group of people over here just standing around idle, just gossiping and talking about others. And they're members of the church. You know that hurt the church in that community. The community saw that. Paul says, deal with it. Get back to work. Eat your own bread. And for those of you who are trying to do right, verse 13, but ye, brethren, be not weary in well-doing. Sometimes when we see others not doing right, that causes us to be discouraged. You know, here we're preaching and teaching, and here we are trying to do right, and these folks are supposed to be Christians. They're not hearing a word of it. Boy, you can get weary in well-doing if you're not careful. Don't throw in the towel, Paul says. You're doing a great work. Just because they're doing wrong, don't let that discourage you. Keep up the fight. Be not weary in well-doing. Don't let their bad example get you down. And then verse 14, and actually we are out of time. There's a lot in verse 14, so I'll tell you what we'll do. We will drive a peg here tonight, 2 Thessalonians 3. Next week we'll start in verse 14. So we'll wrap up the chapter, and we should have time to sort of introduce the book of 1 John. So we'll save that then for next Wednesday night. 2 Thessalonians 3:14 will be our starting place.